this is a problem that the church hasn't adequately responded to because we didn't have a foundation for understanding these topics through that lens. I think we were kind of caught with our pants down a little bit. And that's why you see in a lot of evangelical churches these days, you see the potlucks, you see the donuts before church and the sugary coffee drinks that people are drinking. And you just go to these events and you just see that we don't, it seems somewhat hypocritical.
Hello, and welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast. This is a weekly interview show where I sit down and talk with authors, thought leaders, and influencers who help us understand our changing world. New episodes release every Friday. My guest this week is Andy Felton. Andy is a devoted Christian, husband, father of 2 boys, and the author of Nourished by Design, which we're going to be talking about today, a book exploring the intersection of faith, food, and health. A former nuclear submarine officer and graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Andy now serves as a manager at Los Alamos National Laboratory. After overcoming his own health challenges, he is passionate about helping others align their physical and spiritual well-being with God's design for flourishing. Andy lives in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where he is an active member of Crossroads Bible Church. Andy Felton, welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me today, Will. I really appreciate it.
I just have to tell you, and we've talked a bit offline, your book, Nourished by Design, is one of the best that I've read this year. I enjoyed this book from the beginning until the end. I got a ton out of it, and I'm so grateful that we're having the chance to talk today so that we can let more people know about your book. So thank you for writing this.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. It's really nice to hear.
So let's just start. You say, I think perhaps in the conclusion of the book or in the acknowledgments, that you're neither a theologian nor a nutritionist, a theologian nor a medical doctor, you said. So, and I can understand also how that would have helped you in writing a book like this, but where did the inspiration come from to write Nourished by Design?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I do not have MD anywhere near my name or in my name. But as you probably observed, not coming from this background, that's not the normal route that somebody would take before they write a nutrition book. And it might be a bit audacious to have done so. I originally started my career, as you mentioned, as a nuclear submarine officer. And I kind of started to dabble into the health and wellness space a little bit, as many people do, when I had my own difficulties with health challenges, specifically around anxiety symptoms that I was dealing with. And so I was trying to figure out how I can partner with God to understand how my body was working and just the symptoms that I had and how I can overcome some of that stuff. Fast forward a couple of years to the 2020 timeframe when the whole world was ending and I was largely off of work, just for the separation, and had a lot of extra time on my hands. My wife and I were also dealing at this time with unexplained infertility, so we weren't really sure who was the main problem and what was going on there. We knew that some PCOS was involved on her side, but there were kind of strange symptoms given the fact that both of us, on the surface appeared pretty healthy and, work out and at least tried to be somewhat conscious of our health. And so as we were dealing with this, I started to dive even deeper with this extra time on my hands into just going down the rabbit hole of the health and wellness stuff. And as most people do, I found that, going down this rabbit hole, most of the literature out there is from a secular health and wellness space. And a lot of it, not being written from a Christian perspective, you can see why there would be a lot of potential problems with that if it doesn't really align with a glorifying view of creation and the body and all of those things, right? And it can also be incoherent at times too, because if you don't take those things into account, you can end up far from God's design, in my opinion. And so I think that, there's a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about that stuff, but that's what I was finding. And so as I was looking also for, Christian perspectives on this topic, I was just finding just really thin, the literature that I did find either theologically or scientifically was pretty skimpy at best.
Yeah.
People take a couple verses out of context and they'll, use that as a foundation for health and wellness. And it just didn't didn't work for me. And so I'm a pretty thorough, systematic thinker, and so that's maybe one of the benefits, if not the experience. At least I brought that to this project, and so I said, well, I guess I'll go ahead and just do this myself. And so I did just continue to plunge deeper, get into both the theology side and the science side to present something that I wanted as a reader, and that hopefully other people, coming from that same space would like that as well. So
it was wonderful. Especially my audience knows that I spent 20 years in the New Age, and the New Age is deeply concerned with matters of food and health, but again, not from a Christian perspective. And so you get things going all different kind of directions. You get, food and mysticism, and it all gets mixed up together. And that is a lot of the holistic health space. And it can be very difficult to navigate a bunch of essentially secular people, of different religious or theological beliefs going all these different directions. And I thought that bringing it back to a Christian worldview, sort of Van Tillian presuppositionalism applied to nutrition, helped lend just such an incredible clarity to everything that came after it. And that was my experience of reading the book, is viewed through the lens of God's design. Suddenly all the pieces clicked into place that I think would probably be impossible to come across any otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that there's elements of truth to all of the stuff that's out there, because it's not like these people are writing just completely, there's a reason why a lot of it kind of makes sense. And if you don't have that grounding, then you can definitely go pretty wayward pretty quickly. And I think the idea is just, how do you distill the good stuff, like the actual good science, from all of the other worldview stuff that comes with it. And I think that's a lot of the problem with some of the health space as well, because, one of the big authors in this space, Dr. Robert Lustig, that I quote in the introduction, he talks about how one of the things that he laments in his one of his best-selling books is that the Christian or that the health space was kind of co-opted by religiosity, that religious food principles and dietary principles, and just some of the things that have influenced a lot of just the way that Americans eat, that it comes from this religious perspective. And I think he has a point there, but he's got it all wrong. If he thinks that you can just take it straight back to the science, which is just a tool, because you can't, if it's not grounded in anything true, then you're going to end up in the wrong spot. And so I think he kind of had some of the right ideas there too, but his prescription, I think, is ultimately misguided. And so I want to take the best of the science, couple that with a proper worldview, and ultimately find that I think is the way that we need to ground this. And it makes it simple for people too. You don't have to be a scientist to be evaluating these claims. You can sometimes look at some of the claims that you hear that are supposedly scientific, and you can say, that doesn't sound like it jives well with the way that God created this all to work.
Mm-hmm. And before we get into how God did create it to work, you're one of the few people that I know of who's heard of Leon Kass. When I was a student at Stanford University, I read his book Towards a More Natural Science. And that was by far the best book that I read during my entire time in college. And so I've always remembered who he was, remember that book. I had no idea that he was so widely written in so many subjects. So when you're talking about the hungry soul in the book, it's like, oh, Leon Kass, I know his work. The man is brilliant.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the formative influences, I think, of this. And of course, he writes from a Jewish perspective. And so there's a lot of overlaps there, especially with the Old Testament stuff, that I just wish he would have taken it all the way to Jesus, who is our true food, true drink. But because he didn't quite get there, I think I had to finish it off for him. But I agree. Just the philosophy that he presents is just so rich. And I would implore everyone to read that book.
Yeah, and he comes from a biblical worldview as well, and so there's a real reliability and stability when you proceed from God's word, God's revealed truth, instead of mystical inward experience or some guru who said something one time. It's like, no, this is God's word that we're dealing with, and that's what we can begin to build upon.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that one of the big things that we will probably talk about is how you can actually start with God's word and go quite astray.
Yes, yes.
And a lot of the books that I see in this space, and the people on Instagram promoting these types of things, like the Christian health and wellness, they'll say things like, "Oh, olive oil is talked about 100 times in the Old Testament, therefore you should have olive oil, and figs are talked about X number of times." And it's like, okay, I understand that these are biblical foods per se, but does it being a biblical food, is that an endorsement? What does that actually mean for us? I mean, this is a history of a nomadic sheep herding people, mostly, who was, involved in agriculture and things like that. So you would naturally see a lot of the staples from the environment the geography that they're in, just the society that they're a part of. That doesn't mean that they're bad, but just because, something about food is in the Bible does not mean that that you can just translate that into some sort of prescription for modern day dietary concerns.
Yeah, it's not in and of itself a dietary book. The Bible is not any more than it's a manual for how to repair airplane engines. It provides sort of moral foundations and creational foundations, but it's not giving prescriptive advice for a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger. If people do say, and one thing that I'll point out is there's this book, best-selling book called The Biblio Diet now, and that's one of the things that I think is, the authors are great. I think that they're great Christians. I think that most of their stuff is fantastic, but I think that the way that they go about it is just a little bit different than the way that I do it. I try and start with the truths of who God is, who we are, how God has revealed food to us holistically, and go from there rather than kind of start with the conclusions in Scripture and just kind of hodgepodge them together. And that's really the philosophy that I wanted to use to undergird this book throughout is, some people who want just a quick, tell me what I got to do. There are those people that are going to, hey, I just want a book where you just simply lay it out there and tell me what I need to know. And it's like, you're probably not going to get that with this book because, as you read, the first chapter is all about the theology of the body, essentially. And then we have an Old Testament and a New Testament theology of food and a theology of health that takes you like 80 to 100 pages in before you even really start to get to any of the science. And so somebody who isn't ready for that might be a little bit disappointed until they get to those more practical scientific pieces that rely on those theological foundations. It relies on them being made in a disciplined, rigorous way.
Mm-hmm. Can I offer you a counterpoint to that?
Sure.
So my counterpoint to that is my experience was very different, particularly coming from the world of Reformed theology and Reformed theological culture. I find that there are people that won't be interested in certain practical topics unless you can properly theologically ground it for them first. If you don't start with theology, they're not going to listen to anything you have to say afterwards. And there's a good component of that, and sometimes it can be overused. But I thought that you started from theological foundations, particularly for the unique aspects of the Reformed community, that sort of proves your bona fides, your sincerity, your commitment to biblical truth above, say, science. So I thought you started in the exact right place. Maybe not so much for secular or sort of more mainstream evangelical Christians in the same way who aren't as deeply interested in the theology of things, but for Reformed people, and that's the position that you're writing from, I thought that was exactly the right place to start.
Yeah, well, that's I thought that too. So, and that's what I would have liked to see. I think you talk about someone like Leon Kass, and he has this really elaborate philosophy. He just develops these things from the first principles, and I was just so struck by that type of style that I actually that was I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the biggest influences. I want the big questions answered first, and then we can get to the
Hmm.
practical stuff. So yeah,
And
that's spot on.
and that I thought was important was to answer the big questions, because I don't think you would find that anywhere else. Like, you could go online and probably read a few blog posts about, well, just tell me what to do, but who's going to take the time to carefully parse out the theology from both an Old Testament and New Testament perspective, so that the readers know, who care about theology, a theological perspective applied directly to nutrition. And that, I think, is the giant gap in so many conversations, particularly in the reform world right now, which is talking about Christian nationalism and talking about all these, how do we bring our theology, our beliefs into practice in the world? That's really the question, in our homes, in our families, in our nation. But it's to apply it to diet and to apply it to nutrition, it's a giant gap. Who's going to do that? And that's one of the many things I like about your book, is that you did that. You did the work to do that, which I think no one else was probably going to do in quite the same way.
Yeah, I appreciate that sentiment, and just the fact that you really, recognize that, and that was something that you were looking for. Because I know, people like your audience, it's the theology first, and the Reformed people are rigorous about it, right?
Yeah.
We're Bible people,
Yeah.
and yeah, and that's why I think. Because I also think that if you just come out and talk about, you could go so astray talking about like the dietary laws, or, if you're going for the biblical perspective, but not with the rigor, you can start at Genesis 1 and end right there. Oh yeah, we should eat plants, and that's God's design, right? Like that's
Hmm.
his original creation blessing is fruit and nuts from the garden. I mean, end of story, right? And a lot of
Hmm.
theologians have thought of that too. I think of like Basil the Great talks about this, kind of like vegetarianism has been a big piece of church history. Just over 2,000 years, it's something that we continue to go back and forth and back and forth, um, and so that's why you can't just take one little piece, one little passage. You can't take a proof text to talk about nutrition. Same thing, like you said, about like Christian nationalism and politics and all these other things. The Bible doesn't really have a whole lot to say about these things. It has something to say about it, but it's not going to be direct. It's not coming
Hmm.
out because it's not a manual for these things. One of the things that strikes me as I was thinking, like, why has nobody written this book before? Like, why is it me, working on this book? Um, I realized that this is a problem that's pretty unique to the modern age. Like,
Yeah.
if this was a sin, if dietary concerns were really a big cultural topic during Jesus's age, I'm sure he would have come out and said something about how we should eat, other than,
Hmm.
talking about dietary laws and things like that. But people just ate food. They just ate food. There was nothing that you could eat that wasn't food back in when the
True.
Bible was being written. And now it's actually a minority of things that we eat probably now that are really food, if you if you really think about it, right? So we have this problem, and I think the church in the 20th century, after like the 50s, when we start to get these convenience foods and we start to get a lot of faulty public health advice, and just all these trends that have kind of destroyed our health over the last 75 plus years. This is a problem that the church hasn't adequately responded to because we didn't have a foundation for understanding these topics through that lens. I think we were kind of caught with our pants down a little bit. And that's why you see in a lot of evangelical churches these days, you see the potlucks, you see the donuts before church and the sugary coffee drinks that people are drinking, and you just go to these events, and um, you just see that we don't. It seems somewhat hypocritical that as a church that this is how we understand nutrition. We think of spirituality as though it's some sort of disconnected, abstract, internal thing that doesn't involve anything about matter and the physical universe that we live in. And that's
Hmm.
just absolutely the wrong way to think about it, because our lives are lived here in this body, and we have meaningful actions and meaningful work to do here. And it depends largely on how well we actually care for ourselves, how well
Hmm.
we actually steward our lives as alone held in trust to do the work that God wants us to do. Ultimately, I think that's like the prime motivation for this is as a church, as a kind of a call to the church, like, hey, we've got to figure this out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Especially because I don't think we have a good definition of what health is. I think the mainstream medical industry, and I think you take apart some of these arguments in the book, conceives of health as the absence of disease, right? But is that a sufficient definition? And you actually draw from a theologian for what I think is a practical definition of health. I wonder if you could share his definition of health.
Yeah, so Karl Barth, whatever you have to say about the guy, interesting theologian from the 20th century, he defined, and a lot of his theology is very practical. And so that's why I actually use Barth quite a bit in the theology of meat and theology of health, particularly because he does actually talk about some of these things that were emerging during his time when he was talking about these. But he defines health as strength for life. As simple as that, strength for life. Um, what does that mean for us? Well, we have to look at what is the human life supposed to consist of. We have to look at Jesus as the content and the perfect revelation of what human life is meant to be. And then any strength towards that purpose is what we're talking about when we talk about health. And I think that's so much
Hmm.
better than all the secular, worldly. I contrast this largely with the World Health Organization definitions, which largely secular. We're talking about things like the absence of disease. That one actually comes from somebody who tried to make this a purely scientific concept. He tries to say, well, health is just the absence of disease and the ability to perform a species' natural functions. Well,
Hmm.
what are your natural
Hmm.
functions? Isn't that a worldview problem that we're talking about? That's not a purely scientific question. Even reproduction, which he cites as a natural function, and a lot of people think of that as like a purely scientific concept, evolutionary drive to reproduce. But, I think today's society and the emphasis that we place on reproduction now should not lead us to that conclusion that it's just a given that species should, especially intelligent species in modern life, will want to produce, and that'll be a societal good for them.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think you have to take revelation into account when you think about what is the content of the human life, and then comparing that. I talk about the two distinctions that make strength for life unique as a biblical approach to health. And one of those is that health is a good among goods, which means that you can compare it to other goods of the Christian life. For example, health is not supreme. Uh, think about
Right.
missions trips, right? We know missionaries that are in other countries, and they don't have the same standard of living necessarily as people in America. And so if they're sacrificing their health to go spread the word, is that something that does that defeat your definition of health as like an all-encompassing like thing that you should absolutely pursue? Not necessarily. I think you can do the best that you can. The other thing is that I think health has to be directed towards um, the higher purposes of life, right? Health is only useful if it's enabling you to live a better Christian life, to live out your calling, to care for your neighbor, to do the works that God has for you. you can imagine how sad a state it is. And I see this, I actually was just looking at a post on Instagram yesterday about some guy who's trying to live to 200, and he spends like $2 million a year on like biohacking
Is that Brian
therapies.
Johnson?
I can't remember if it's that guy. There's a couple other those biohackers that, and I just think about how sad that is, that they're just sitting there like constantly just thinking about how long they're going to live, and just doing, they could be giving money they could probably live a nice, healthy life to be 100 years old and give all that money to charity and, invest in worthy causes and, raise kids and do all these things that Christians are called to do in many cases. And he's, sitting in a hypobaric chamber somewhere, spending all this money just to live longer. It's like, yes, I think we should desire to live longer as Christians. I think that's one of the, the conclusions of what a proper definition of health looks like, is that we should strive to avoid disease and we should strive to live longer as we're given that opportunity. But it's ultimately living for a purpose and not just to, forestall death or conquer death.
That's so interesting for so many reasons. One of which is because there's a lot of focus, and I don't want to necessarily go down a rabbit trail with this, but just to illustrate the point, there's so much discussion today of mental health. It's like, oh, congratulations, you're mentally healthy. What are you doing with that mental health? And I pursued mental health for many years, psychotherapy and stuff like that. And it didn't actually improve the quality of my moral life. It gave me the ability to pursue ungodly things. So if you're taking health, as you say, a good among goods, and you're not applying it to the correct activities, then you're just misusing the health that you've acquired. Sort of like this man who's trying to live to 200. Like perhaps he's attained some scientific markers of health, some ability that others of his age might not have. But what's he applying it to? He's applying it ultimately to deeply narcissistic ends, and he's documenting his journey for thousands of followers, presumably as well.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you said, you could be quite unhealthy too if you're just pursuing proper, mental health. If you're pursuing mental health for the sake of mental health, you'll just be sitting there thinking about mental health the whole time, and that doesn't seem like a very healthy place to be.
Yes, paradoxically so. So there are so many areas that I want to talk about of the way that people go wrong with health from a secular and from a Christian standpoint. And maybe we'll have time to get to those, but I really want to focus on what it means to get health right, because I think that will be the most valuable takeaway for people in a conversation like this. And the concept that you clarified the most for me was metabolic health. And of course, that's a very popular term over the past, I think, 5-10 years, something like this. Everything that I've seen has been quite nebulous about what that means, but you took it apart in a very clear way that left me understanding at the end of it, oh, that's what this is and how it's part of God's design. So I wonder if we can talk about what metabolic health is, and then we can talk about how to cultivate it.
Absolutely. So as a kind of precise encapsulation of what metabolic health is, I think it's simply put as the ability to properly energize your cells and the ability to do so in a way that doesn't leave them with all sorts of metabolic byproducts that build up. So essentially, can you make energy in your cells, and can you clean them and repair them to keep them going? Ultimately, that's a definition of metabolic health. And even that can be kind of nebulous. Okay, what exactly does that mean? And how does that relate to all these other things that I'm hearing about the gut and about inflammation? And it's good that we're actually talking about these, because I think, 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have even been using these terms at all. People would have been saying, what is metabolic health? At least we're using the words now, and especially with like the MAHA movement, and, interestingly, how that's been manifest mostly kind of on the religious Christian right. Really kind of fascinating that that's come to be. And yeah, I think like you said, people are using these terms and they don't exactly know how to break it down. And that's what I was finding too, as I was looking at all these books. Every book had a different piece of the puzzle. One person talks about how gut health is just everything and you should just, think about nothing other than your gut. And then you talk about other people who are talking about your mitochondria and other people with, insulin. And so I tried to systematize it with the best available science that we have. And that's where I came down with this framework of the sign being insulin resistance, or at least in terms of metabolic dysfunction, the opposite of metabolic health. The two key contributors or key mechanisms being inflammation and oxidation, and then a variety of different key contributors that kind of promote inflammation and oxidation. And among those, I consider things like mitochondrial dysfunction and leaky gut and mineral imbalances. And these are the lowest level of the triangle, if you will. And those are the things that we can actually directly attack through diet. What are we actually eating for? It's to improve your gut health, your mitochondrial health, your mineral balances, all of these things that will potentially influence your state of inflammation, oxidation, and leave you with healthy insulin function or not. And so we can get into, if you'd like, I can kind of go deeper into what these things mean for us. But that's essentially how I systematized this umbrella term of metabolic health and then metabolic dysfunction as essentially the key root of all of our diseases. And I'd like to take a moment too to talk about just how metabolic dysfunction manifests. Because you're not really typically diagnosed with metabolic dysfunction. I wish we did diagnose people that way in this country, but you're diagnosed with cancer, Alzheimer's, depression, infertility, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel disease. And so basically the theory that I use here is that metabolic health is the driver of every single one of these manifestations of it. Every chronic illness that we are witnessing today and that many people are experiencing, most people with 2 to 3 chronic illnesses and several, drugs that they're taking, these are all from the same root cause. It's that inability to power your cells. And if you think about it, like from this root principle, it's pretty liberating because it gives us only one problem that you have to deal with. You might have 3 different manifestations of that problem. You might have diabetes and you might have heart disease and your kidney might be failing. But the beauty of it is that you don't have to, you might be working with a cardiologist and, a nutritionist and a variety of different people. You only have to tackle one problem, and that's how do you energize your cells? Because every cell in your body comes from a stem cell, and that stem cell starts out with the same basic blueprint, and it can be turned into any of one over 200 or so cell types. That's exactly how metabolic dysfunction manifests in the body, because it's the same root cause. It's metabolic dysfunction is essentially the stem cell of disease. And that's the kind of the comparison I make to drive that point home so that people ultimately can be liberated with the understanding that they only have to correct this basic fundamental problem. And if they can direct their lifestyle habits, nutrition included, into fixing those underlying issues that are causing metabolic dysfunction, then a lot of this stuff can be reversed fairly easily.
It's sort of like a grand unified theory of a lot of, chronic diseases that people are chronic, and in some cases acute diseases that people are struggling with. Metabolic health is underlying all of them. It's the root of all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we can talk about, I think that the biggest things being insulin resistance as the sign that I mentioned, right? How do you actually know if you have metabolic dysfunction? Well, you can actually diagnose insulin resistance. Insulin, for those who don't know, is this hormone that your pancreas makes, and whenever you eat and your blood pressure, your blood sugar goes up, all this energy is going into your blood, and the body's task is to figure out, how do I store this energy so that it's not all in my blood at the same time? I like to use the analogy of a wallet, and blood glucose is like your cash. You never would carry your life savings in your wallet, because that's a very precarious situation to be in. Similarly, your blood does not like to keep all of your energy resources within the blood, because that's a very toxic situation to be in, because too high of a blood sugar is very bad. We can talk about that later. But the role of insulin then is to take all of this cash floating around in your blood and to put it in all of the organs that will receive it, such as your liver or your fat cells or your muscles if they're activating. Insulin is a storage hormone. And if it works well, then it will quickly lower your blood sugar back to a reasonable range after you've eaten a meal. The problem is that for many people, their cells are resistant to insulin's signal. So the insulin signal is there. It's telling the cell to take in this glucose from the bloodstream, but the cell does not want to take it because the cell is unhealthy and it's unwilling to accept more of this glucose that it can't efficiently process. And so that's the, kind of the layman's terms understanding of what insulin resistance is. You have a lot of insulin that's trying to do its job of lowering blood sugar, and it's not being very effective at doing that. And so you can actually diagnose this. This is something that normally does not get diagnosed at your doctor's office. A lot of times they look at blood sugar as like the driving factor behind things like diabetes and prediabetes. You'll see those diagnosed. If your blood sugar gets to 100 to 125, you're in the range of prediabetes. And then if you're higher than 125, you'd be formally diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. But you can know if you have insulin resistance far before those thresholds are met, and then you can reverse it by applying basic nutritional principles. And the way that you would know that, among others, is testing insulin. It's amazing that we don't test insulin when insulin resistance is our key sign of this fundamental disease that people have. But if you work with a functional nutritionist or some sort of functional doctor, or there's so many direct to consumer, health and wellness services where you can go get blood work and stuff like that, especially targeted toward men now. There's things called like Blokes and some other companies that have these man specific panels that'll test testosterone and all these other things. You can really take your health into your own hands. And a lot of these are going to have insulin on the panel. Or you can just ask your doctor, hey, I'm really concerned and I want to know what my insulin levels are. And if you can take your fasting insulin levels and you can compare that with your fasting glucose levels, and you can calculate the level of insulin resistance that you have far before you would ever manifest some of these issues like prediabetes or diabetes. And so that's why I say that insulin resistance is the sign. It's not the root cause. You can't just fix insulin resistance, and it doesn't just manifest out of nowhere. But if you properly understand it as the thing that's common to essentially every case of metabolic dysfunction, then you can diagnose it pretty simply with a simple blood test.
Just want to speak. Yeah. Oh, please go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to move on to like inflammation and oxidation, but if you have something else there on the insulin stuff.
Yeah, just to interject really quickly, if everyone listening feels like we've made a sudden shift from theology, deep theology into science, that shift is actually intentional, and it's one of the features of the book. I remember when I think we moved into the second act of the book. So the first act is very deep explorations of theology, and then the second act of the book and the third act of the book, well, the second act is very much about the science of health, and it's actually quite a big shift as you move from one into the other. And it took me a minute to sort of orient as I was reading the book, like what just happened. But it was actually, once I started digging in, I understood that the scientific meticulous nature of approaching the science and the meticulous nature of approaching the theology were actually both really equally important, because a book that's just about the theology of nutrition, I think it would be necessary and very needed, but that it doesn't actually ground it in the best practices of science and our understanding of the human body, it would be missing something. And it was the communication, the exploration of science, the way the body processes work, that really took the theology and made it real and practical when I was reading. It's like, oh, this is God's design for our body. It's not enough to just say God has a design for our body. Instead, it's let's look at God's design for our body as the best of science, as the good part of science has helped us understand. So if anyone's detecting that rather sudden shift to a tone, that's actually part of the book, and it's a really important part of the book as well.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, because we did just go straight into it. But it is important for people to understand these things on at least some sort of basic level, because, like you said, you could read a theological treatise on these topics and then say, okay, well, that was nice that I know why health is important. And
well, a lot of reform people would write that book. A lot of reform people would write that book. Exactly. Okay, cool. I have a treatise, and then now I'm going to go, go to McDonald's or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think just bringing it back to, we've got the theology now. What does it mean? And then how can we break down the science so that you don't have to have a PhD to understand this stuff? Because I don't have a PhD, and I tried to present this stuff in a way that makes sense, because I think God created us to be rational creatures who can understand His creation, at least to some extent, that we can learn a little bit about who God is by the way that He's created us. And there's something good about knowing these things, about just diving into to who we are. There's this quote that I share in the book by Calvin, and he talks about how there's these multiple sources of revelation, and how knowing ourselves is almost as important as knowing about God, and almost that it's hard to know if we should know more about God and then ourselves, or if we should know more about ourselves before we understand God, because that's how He's created us. He's revealed to us a lot of just revelation is based on about how we're designed, how God created food for us, how God created the earth for us, so that we could understand and really enact His intentions for us with these tangible object lessons.
Mm-hmm. But just as sort of a lot of the theological discussions today tend to focus on subjects like cosmology, where did the universe come from, or environmentalism, or sort of maybe ecology in a broad sense, like, or evolutionary biology, stuff like that. You're sort of pushing back on those from a theological perspective. There isn't that on, well, let's look at God's design for the body. Like, I don't think that theological approach has been married yet, except now in your book it has been, to let's actually look at the scientific design for the body and put those two pieces together. I mean, you have Stephen Meyer, who puts theology together with evolutionary biology, or sort of refutes evolutionary biology and cosmology, of course, but this was a missing piece, and it's one that's so practical in people's lives because it gets down to what we do several times a day. And so that to understand God's revelation in the construction of the body is something that I think is so important and very real. It's very real. Like, oh, this is how my body works. This is this thing that I'm inhabiting, that I live in, that's mine, that's me. This is how it actually works. But no one had ever explained it to me in that level of clarity and with that level of theological perspective. And I found that shocking in a sense, like, oh, no one's ever thought about this before, but also very much like, oh, this is the time to start doing that, especially given how much these subjects are up for the past 5 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you bring up things like cosmology and politics and all these other things that we are doing a good job of. And I love Stephen Meyer's work. I quote him as well, right next to the quote with Calvin. But as fun as it is to think about those topics, and the various apologetic reasons to refute materialistic evolution and stuff like that, they're so abstract and far from our daily experience
Exactly.
They might be good on like an apologetics level if I'm really engaging in some sort of conversation with a skeptic who who's also likewise interested in cosmology, which is like very few people. But when I'm actually showing up every day for my family and for myself and for my community, and I'm eating 3 times a day. I mean, think about it. Like that's what we do is we eat. I mean, people, for most of history, eating has been what they think about all day, right? They have to go gather food and make food. And, oh, if the weather's not good this year, then I'm not going to get much food. And the amount of anxiety around just putting food on the table, our biggest concern these days is not eating too much. And yet, for some reason, this thing that we do to live every single day is thrown away in theological circles as though it's something that's off limits. You know, people don't like to talk about nutrition in the church. I find that, you know, I talk about it with people sometimes, and it's almost like, oh, that's like kind of like a private thing that you know, it's like this touchy subject. It's like talking about religion or something at the dinner table, and politics. And when you start talking about food and health and wellness and stuff like that. But out of all of these topics, it's the most practical. I mean, it really is the most practical. And I think that God reveals that to us for a reason. I mean, he creates us with needy bodies that require food. I mean, theoretically, he didn't have to do that. He did that for a reason, and that was to demonstrate to us 3 times a day that we actually require God to live, and that he graciously meets our needs to live an abundant life, and that he does so not just as animals who eat one thing over and over again, but with abundant variety and with culinary arts, and in a way that enhances our fellowship and causes us to be in community and communion with not only other people, but also plants and animals and the rest of his creation. I mean, just talk about the richness of this topic that we oftentimes just neglect in the church. And maybe I'm speaking too strongly about that.
I don't think so.
I hope I'm not, but I think it really is one of those things that it's mind-boggling to me that we haven't. We don't have a more mature discussion about this.
But I mean, we haven't really needed it in quite the same way that we do today. You know, 100 years ago, people could only eat food. And now you can literally go to the store and find aisles full of industrial byproducts marketed as edible. And so this is a genuine historical novelty that is compelling a theological response that in some sense it's late. I don't mean to say that you should have written this book 50 years ago, but I mean, meaning that we're 60 years into this industrial food production, perhaps longer. So thinking about this would have been needed quite a long time ago. It would have been, quite beneficial a long time ago, but particularly after COVID, I think it's become even more necessary as everyone is starting to ask questions about literally everything, but the symptoms and the signs of ill health are all around us. I think about the obesity epidemic, and it is an epidemic. Like, you can't avoid it now, and it's spreading around the world. And so now there's the need to, and no one really is willing to say why. We can say many reasons why, but no one's really willing to put their finger on it because it points to so many other things that are sick about our society. So it's sort of been overlooked. There's a convenient aspect to it being overlooked because it involves us all. It allows us all to kind of hide certain things about our lifestyles. But now it's getting to the point where, the elephant is in the room and the elephant is getting larger. So let's talk about the elephant.
That's awesome. The elephant is getting larger. It's funny that gluttony is the socially acceptable sin. It's not funny, but it's interesting that gluttony is being recognized as the socially acceptable sin these days in the church. It's the sin that you can't talk about, right? And that's all that people used to talk about If you talk,
Yeah.
you look at people, the early theologians, gluttons were like the lowest of the low. When they called Jesus a glutton, you look at the Old Testament passages about what that word really meant and what they're entailing. One of the passages talks about people who should be stoned to death. I mean, and that's not to say that that there aren't other sins that are, equally or more important. But it seems like what we think about this, it would be very difficult to approach someone in the church and say, even somebody in a leadership position, especially, and say, hey, like, there's evidence here. Most sins you don't wear when you show up to church, right? There are a lot of sins that people have that are more private. And unfortunately for many people, gluttony and just, not always just strictly gluttony, but just, a lot of people just, they gain weight and they're unhealthy and they're doing things that maybe they think are right. They're not even like trying to eat too much. Maybe they're not even eating that much, but they're just sending all the wrong signals to their body. And so, I have compassion for some people too who get cast in this light as, you could easily see that going the wrong way. And it's just about understanding how our bodies work so that we can, so that we understand what it is that we should do and how we can correct those things, whether it's a sinful pattern that we're in, or whether it's just, just a weight. I distinguish between weights and sins in the book when it comes to this, because I think it's such a delicate topic when you're talking about this stuff. And, but yeah, you talk about this, how like we're kind of start to talk about this more in society, and you've got the MAHA moment that we're in right now, where this is becoming
Make America healthy again.
Yeah, taken up by the right. So odd. Because there's this. I live in northern New Mexico, which is not exactly a bastion of conservatism. And so I go to the local food co-op in Santa Fe, and a month ago, I think was the last time I went, and I'm going through the parking lot, and I'm just seeing bumper sticker after bumper sticker, like every tree is sacred, and every fetus is not a human. All these various like odd, like kind of liberal tree hugger bumper stickers. And I'm like, man, I'm in the wrong place. There's a purple over there with like purple hair, and somebody with like, just kind of hanging on the side of the road with like a guitar. And this is just not my jam here. But then I walk into the food co-op, and it's just abundant. There's just fresh fruits and vegetables, all sorts of fantastic stuff. There's like organ meats. It's the only place I can get raw milk. That's why I go there occasionally. You can get raw cheeses and all sorts of like high quality delicacies, and fresh baked sourdough every morning. And I'm like, man, this is a place of abundance, and they've figured out more of a biblical Christian understanding of food and health and community than most of the people at my church.
Yeah.
I mean, it's remarkable. And Joel Salatin, who wrote the foreword to my book, and he's somebody who's becoming more and more popular these days, especially with this movement. Thank God, because he's such an amazing person. And he talks about this quite often as just this hypocrisy of how he's kind of lived in these dual worlds of, I've kind of got my hippie tree hugger friends over here, and then I've got kind of my conservative farmer friends over here, and he straddles these two worlds, and he tries to reconcile them, and they both point fingers at the other. They both say, oh, well, those tree huggers, they're so they think they're so compassionate when they're hugging a tree, and then they're going around with pro-abortion signs and things like that. And then he talks to the tree huggers, and they're like, oh, those Christians, they go to church and they talk about all of God's creation and all this stuff. And then, they go to their anti-abortion rallies and they think they're so righteous. And then they go stop on the way home and have McDonald's. It's like, do you know what happened to that cow and the food processing and all the things that went through to get that to your plate. And so they think that we're just as hypocritical, right? And
They're
that's
not
the point
wrong.
that he's been making for a long time. And so I think it's interesting how you bring up these kind of like just changing political landscape around some of these topics, and just how this conversation is being finally given due credit, and just how interesting it is that the lines of division are kind of almost shifting a little
Mm-hmm.
bit.
Mm-hmm. Before we get back to the question of metabolic health, I want to. You've helped me clarify some distinctions in my own mind, and I want to road test them here for a minute. So gluttony as just a general overeating, like a gross sinful overeating, like a devouring kind of, that will definitely have physical effects in terms of obesity. But I have a friend who talks about we're in an obesogenic culture, meaning we live in a world with a food system of food production that actually is designed to make us fat, and it does that quite well, in fact. And so you can be leading what you perceive is a normal life based on worldly standards, and yet still through inactivity, but also in caution in terms of what you're eating, can still gain weight without necessarily being a glutton. Like, oh, I don't eat, more than anyone else. I'm not doing 3 plates every night. But slowly over time, due to the quality and just a little bit too much food of not high enough quality, just adds the weight on without ever actually crossing into sinful gluttony. And I think and plus also you add into that the Christian culture of breaking bread together. So much generosity in terms of food. It blows my mind. My church does potlucks like twice a month, and people just bring so much food, which obviously isn't free, and they prepare it so well and they just give it freely. And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful aspects of Christian culture. And so you have, people aren't necessarily being sinful in terms of how much they eat. You can't necessarily point to someone and say you're a glutton, but people just naturally eat the food that's produced, and people want to give. And so that can create the effect of the appearance of gluttony, the visual consequences of what might be gluttony without actually being gluttony. And I think all these things get wrapped together to produce some of that sensitivity where it's like, I don't actually know that I did anything wrong. My body says maybe I did, perhaps over time, a long, slow wrong instead of, a very quick, short wrong. But I think these things are what makes it so sensitive, because people don't perceive themselves as having been in sin, right? But they don't necessarily how to get out of where they're at. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I think you hit it just absolutely. That we just live in such a broken society when it comes to food, that just if you're not actually going out of your way to understand these things and to figure out how you're going to deal with this problem, yeah, I mean, you might have good intentions, and you might be doing that. You might even be doing exactly what your doctor tells you to do. That's the saddest part of this whole thing. Is a lot of times you go to the doctor and you're going to get just the worst advice. And and I hate to say it, but I've been misled many times. Your cholesterol is too high. You should start cutting out the red meat, and we're going to put you on a statin and stuff like that. And I'm like, do you realize the side effects of that statin for somebody who is in their 30s and, trying to have kids and things like that? Like, give me a break. And so, yeah, it's just that culture. And I think part of it too is that people, we've been told for a long time that a calorie is a calorie. And we have this most of nutrition science has historically been the calories in, calories out method of calculating. And so that's why people count their calories and things like that. And so that's just the space that we've been in. And so people think that if they see somebody who's overweight, oh, that person just had too many calories and didn't do enough exercise, right? And so they're just eating too much. And that's not exactly the case. And part of the reason I think that that's not the case is because I break it down in the book that our cells need more than just energy. They need information, building blocks, and energy. Energy is just one piece of it. And a lot of it, food provides all of those things, and food-like substances, also provide those things too. And we're adapted to, our appetites are adapted to how much energy we're taking in largely. but our appetites don't really understand some of the information piece. The the information that our food or the things that we're eating is communicating to our cells about the world around us and the state that we're in. Just the nutrients that we're receiving are telling our body what to do and how to respond to the next meal. And so if you're eating a nutrient-dense diet that has the correct signals that your body is looking for, then your cells are going to know what hormones to make and when to make them. And so maybe because it's not just what you eat, but it's how your hormones handle the food that you eat. And so if your hormones are way out of whack, you're going to put on weight, even if you didn't eat more than the other guy who's, who eats a ton and is maybe a glutton, but is seems to be pretty lean, right? And so when we get out of this simplistic understanding of nutrition, that food is just energy, and we start to look at the information and the signals that our food is communicating to us. And that's why I even talk about things like information in the book, like our DNA. People don't realize the extent to which people think our DNA is just a static blueprint of instructions for how the body is going to be created. And you just give it some food and it's just going to sprout into the same body every time. But your DNA is a kind of more of a menu of options, and it really depends on the extra information that it's receiving about the environment. What things are going to be made? What thing on the menu is going to be made? And people don't understand that. So that's where it really becomes tangible, I think, for people.
All that stuff. That distinction that you put in the book about not all calories are the same, maybe from the perspective of the law of thermodynamics, all calories are the same, but not from the perspective of my body. And so I've actually had that thought running through my head. We eat pretty healthy here at home. We're careful about the things we choose, but it's also like me thinking in terms of the way that you talk about in the book, that what signals am I sending to my body by the things that I'm eating? What information am I giving to my cells? What version of myself am I calling forth, you might say, out of my DNA by the choices that I'm making? And all of these things are completely left out of the calories in, calories out paradigm. It's like it's almost like a mechanistic portrayal of us. I wanted to use the analogy of a car earlier, even as imprecise as it is, but that's also kind of the way that we think. Like, I put in energy and I get stuff out. It's like, well, no, our bodies are living responsive things. And so we're not just eating calories, we're eating things. And those things direct our bodies in particular ways, in questions that I don't think a lot of people have really asked to the depth that you did in the book.
Yeah. And as you bring that up, this information piece, that's where you start to get into some more of the richness of the theology, because you talk about how you're not just eating the energy, you're also consuming this information. And what you're doing is, the logic of the universe is essentially what, we not only have a plan for how our bodies should be made, but there's a plan for how everything in the universe should be created. And we talk about that as like the logos of creation, right? The underlying logic and order behind all things. And that's a title that John explicitly gives to Jesus, right? Jesus is the divine word, the divine logos, who imbues creation, and through him, everything is made and upheld in creation. And when you think about it like that, like food is this tangible expression of God's divine plan, God's divine logic. And if you're eating according to his logic, you're going to get the right signals, right? You could either be inserting God's logic into your body, and that could be the thing that animates your DNA and your mitochondria to create the person who you are. Or you could be inserting some sort of counterfeit, some sort of man-made, machine-created chemical, with some sort of weird name on a nutrition label somewhere. That could be the logic. And the way that I see it is mankind is pretty, we've got a certain amount of intelligence, but none of it even comes close to the logic of Jesus through which he creates the universe.
Brothers, are you stuck? Anxiety crushing you? Depression holding you back? Anger burning inside? You know you're made for more, but how do you actually get there? What if I told you that in 90 days, you could go from where you are right now to freedom in Christ, from fear to confidence, confusion to clarity, and bondage to freedom? Is that even possible? Yes, I've seen it happen. Chris, 30 pounds gone, marriage restored. Ben, freed from his past and fearless about his future. Pierre, massive pay increase. Stephen, now married and his wife just gave birth to a son. Real men, real results, using scripture. Here's exactly what to expect from my program. We begin with your chance to be heard in full, your complete story. Then 24-hour support, 6 days a week, so you never walk alone. And most importantly, biblical foundations. Not feminized psychology or worldly red pill nonsense that keeps you angry and far from God. I use the tools that I know work because they worked for me. In 2012, I was lost, gripped by sin and idolatry. But with hard work and God's abounding grace, today I'm building a platform that reaches thousands and a family with the woman of my dreams. And I can help facilitate a similar transformation for you. Right now, book a free 30-minute call. I'll show you exactly where you are, where you're going, and what's holding you back. No cost, no commitment, just clarity. The question isn't whether freedom is possible. Christ already promised it to you. The question is, will you take the next step today? Go to willspencer.co/mentorship and book your free call today. The link is in the description. I only work with a few men each quarter, so act fast. Once again, visit willspencer.co/mentorship and book your free call today. I want everyone listening to rewind about 30 seconds and listen to that again. Whether the food that we're eating is communicating God's logic or the machine's logic. Like that is a heavy thought, because I feel that. I feel that. We see the machine's logic all around us all the time with the increasing technologization of society. Artificial intelligence is just a manifestation of that. Transhumanism is a manifestation of that. All of these things we're aware of. But in terms of the machine being taken literally into our bodies and promoting its logic to our cells versus what is God's logic, like that's a heavy thought, and that's real, and that's immediate. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and that's why we have the theology piece, right? That's the New Testament theology chapter. Is like Jesus reveals to us what food is because he calls himself food. Right. He is the pinnacle of our diet. And based on that pinnacle, we can understand what food was meant to be. Because if God gave us food that was red dye 40 and bleached flour with iron shavings in it and all these things that we try and concoct, and it caused sickness and disease like it is today, and then Jesus came out and said, no, I'm your food, we'd be like, oh, so are you going to cause sickness like this food does? No, he wants that analogy, that reality. It's not just a metaphor per se, but that reality only makes sense because food was understood to be life-giving.
Mm-hmm. So I want to continue down that road, but I'm going to make the hard decision to take us back to where we were talking about insulin resistance, because I think it's important that we spend some time in theology and worldview and philosophical issues, but I think the practical aspect of it is equally important. I want to make sure that we go back to that. So just to pick up that thread, so insulin is the hormone that allocates energy from food into our cells, and so the cell receives insulin, and the insulin tells the cell how much energy to take in. Insulin resistance is when the cell says it needs more insulin to tell it to take energy in. So insulin's saying, take energy in, and the cell's like, no, I'm not listening to you. So more insulin is produced, and that's insulin resistance.
Exactly. Spot on. Okay. Yeah. So insulin and hyperinsulinemia, aka too much insulin in the blood, those are essentially the same thing. Because you're just saying insulin resistance just means that insulin is not efficient at doing its job. And so the pancreas is making more and more and more of it.
Mm-hmm. What creates that? What creates insulin resistance?
Yeah. So what creates insulin resistance? And I said that it's the sign before. It's not necessarily the driving factor. The driving factors, as we, science tends to consolidate around a variety of things, but inflammation and oxidation seem to be the thing that's the common thread between all of these, the metabolic science and just the pathology of disease, is inflammation and oxidation. It manifests sometimes in different ways and in different tissues, but it's the same thing, inflammation, right? What is inflammation? Inflammation is a immune system response. It is something that we absolutely need. It's something that your body does on purpose. You're supposed to have inflammation. The reason why we have inflammatory signals and why our immune system uses this tool is because it's just that. It's a tool to combat the various injuries or stressors that we have in life. So if you get a cut on your finger, you're going to have inflammation there. That would be healing inflammation, and that's the types of signals and processes that your immune system is using to combat that. Now, that would be acute inflammation if you had a cut or something like that. And that's the kind of inflammation that we're looking for. The problem with inflammation is when you have it in the wrong location or in the wrong dose. So if you have this chronic, widespread, low-grade inflammation, it's essentially the inflammation comes from the root word of inflammare, or I'm not sure the Latin, but meaning fire. It's just like a smoldering fire. So this chronic low-grade inflammation is what's really driving disease, because you essentially just have a smoldering body. And that is going to disrupt all sorts of processes in your body. All of the processes that like insulin signaling requires, for example, are degraded when you have this chronic low-grade inflammation. And so just inflammation itself is going to cause you to be less insulin sensitive and more insulin resistant. Okay, so then we talk about inflammation. We also have oxidation. Oxidation and inflammation are thought of a lot of times as essentially kind of the same thing. But while inflammation is a bodily process that we're designed to do, and our body is doing a good thing by doing it, oxidation is just a chemical process. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a thing that happens. In our body, you can think of things like rust. Rust on your car is oxidation. And what it actually means is that in your body, certain substances or molecules are stripping electrons away from the various proteins and fats and DNA and other molecules that you need to survive. And by stripping away these electrons, they're essentially damaging these molecules. And a lot of times you have chain reactions where if one reactive substance strips the electrons from this other thing. Now the other thing wants more electrons, so it's going to start to strip electrons from other things, and you start to get this cascade of oxidation. And so the interesting thing about inflammation and oxidation is that they can influence each other. For example, oxidative stress can actually cause an inflammatory response because your immune system understands that something is going wrong over here, and it sends these troops and it sends these inflammatory markers that are going to go mark out that spot and try and rally to come to their aid. And so that's why a lot of times these processes are somewhat intertwined. One of them, though, is just a simple biomechanical process. It's just something that happens. It's neither good nor bad. And you actually have to have, just like you have to have some inflammation, you actually have to have some oxidation as well. Your body runs on redox processes, reduction and oxidation. They're inverse of each other. And those redox reactions need to be in balance. The problem is when the oxidation is in this huge imbalance with the reduction, and so you end up with oxidative stress. So that's essentially the thing that drives disease. It still seems kind of nebulous, but when you see studies that correlate seemingly seemingly removed diseases that don't seem to be related at all to just general metabolic function and insulin resistance, you start to see that, even like tooth decay can actually make you less insulin sensitive and more insulin resistant. It's just an
Yeah.
example of how tooth decay just causes inflammation, and the inflammation causes the metabolic dysfunction.
Well, the body it's an incredibly designed system. I mean, the evolutionary argument falls apart completely when you start looking at various aspects like the eye, irreducible complexity. But as you lay out in the book, processes that I've heard about or seen referenced, you make them clear in meticulous detail. And there's no way I was struck with the thought throughout reading, there's no way that this could have come about by accident. Like, come on, give me a break that this sort of evolved naturally, forget it. So let me see if I can put some of the pieces together. So inflammation is sort of a broad-based immune system response. We're supposed to have inflammation in local places. If there's a wound or an injury, it's actually productive. But when the whole body is inflamed, the immune system is acting like the whole body is sick, and that creates systemic inflammation throughout the body, which increases oxidation, which then feeds back to inflammation. Do I have that part right? So you end up in kind of this vicious cycle where inflammation feeds oxidation, which greater feeds inflammation, and then that leads to many of these diseases we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think you've got it about as good as anyone would need to understand it.
Okay. And then where does the insulin resistance piece fit into that? Is that part of the inflammation? Does that create the inflammation because you have all this spare blood sugar around? How does that fit in?
So the inflammation and the oxidation are generally going to be drivers of metabolic dysfunction that manifests as insulin resistance.
Okay, got it.
And so they're essentially the cause. And that's why when I connect things like the tooth decay, like nobody would think of gum disease and metabolic dysfunction as relating to each other. But because you have tooth decay that causes inflammation throughout the body, it actually results in insulin resistance. And it has to do with the fact that the insulin signaling is impaired when you've got all this inflammation going on. When you've got inflammation attacking your cells, attacking your cell membranes, maybe even the insulin molecule itself, it becomes less effective at doing its job. Same thing with oxidation. If you have oxidative stress on your cell membranes where the insulin is attaching, and oxidative stress in the GLUT4 transporter that your cell is sending to the cell membrane where the insulin is calling it. And, all of these different like biochemical processes are degraded by the presence of widespread oxidation and inflammation.
So it just makes everything go wrong systemically slowly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you think one of the things we deal with today is fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's a real thing. And it's one of the hallmarks of diabetes and metabolic dysfunction in general. And one of the things that causes that and how that is intertwined so much with insulin functioning is you start to get this fat building up inside your organs, such as your liver. And then you have these inflammatory molecules that will start to attack that fat, and it'll create this mean fat called ceramides. And ceramides will just destroy everything around it. So now your liver is not working well. And your liver is one of your most important metabolic organs. And so you better believe that if your liver is not functioning well because you've got this inflammation going on in the fat that it's holding, you're going to have real problems with your metabolic health because your liver is such an important piece of that. We don't have to get into all the stuff your liver does, but it's quite abundantly clear that inflammation and oxidation have something to do with every problem that manifests through the metabolic, all of our metabolic processes. And so if we go one step below that too, and so then the next kind of level to help illustrate this, for example, mitochondrial dysfunction is one of these buzzwords that people are throwing around these days for good reason. And because I think mitochondrial dysfunction is that lower level where a lot of the inflammation and oxidation are coming from, and it's part of the reason why we have metabolic dysfunction. And so if you think about, so I'll step back for a second and talk about just a high level understanding of what how energy works and how God designed it, because it's so amazing that sunlight is converted into chemical energy through photosynthesis. So plants just take the sunlight energy, they convert it into chemical bonds, and they store it in those carbon to carbon and carbon to hydrogen bonds. And then we eat that stuff in the form of fats and carbohydrates. And that energy gets broken down through various processes in the cell, and it creates these high energy electrons. And these high energy electrons have the potential energy associated with the sunlight that it originally came from. And they get sucked through these series of complexes on the mitochondrial membrane called the electron transport chain. And this is all made possible by oxygen. And as these electrons are flowing, what do we get? Electricity. We get the flow of electrons is electrical energy. And so this electrical energy gets used essentially to drive this big turbine that's just pumping through these protons. And this turbine is causing ADP to get turned into ATP. ATP is the stuff, the energy molecule that makes all of your chemical reactions occur. And so essentially you're starting with light energy, you get chemical energy, you're turning it to electrical energy in the cell, and then you're turning it back into, you're storing it back into chemical bonds. And the electrical part breaks down quite rapidly when the electrons start shooting out of the electron transport chain. And when your cells are unhealthy because you're not giving them the proper nutrients, or they're under too much stress, or, you're giving them all sorts of bad nutrients or anti-nutrients, these electrons leak out of the chain. And these electrons end up causing oxidation. And so you end up with, if you have faulty mitochondria, which are supposed to be producing energy for your cell, it's going to manifest as oxidation in the cell. Okay, so that's damaging all sorts of molecules inside your cell. And that's part of the reason why deliberately, when oxidation goes up, your cell is actually designed to not be able to answer the call of insulin. It's actually built in to where when you have these oxidative molecules, you actually can't receive insulin's signal to get, and that's just a built-in safety protocol to make sure that you don't get any more glucose in there, because you obviously can't manage it. That mitochondria is struggling. So that's the oxidation piece. And then the inflammation comes in when your body is seeing this cell struggling to make energy, and it comes over here and it tries to help, but it doesn't really know what to do. It can't correct the factors that caused the energy problem. It can't cause you to get out and, see the sun every once in a while and do some exercise and eat right and sleep right. So it just throws up, inflammatory markers, Hail Marys, and saying, hey, come over here and immune system, do your thing. And so you start, it's just, your immune system is ill-equipped to handle mitochondrial dysfunction. It just doesn't work. And so you can start to see, just from that example of mitochondrial dysfunction and not giving the cells the things that it needs, how you can start to see the breakdown of the cell. You can start to see how oxidation is influencing that, and then how inflammation is this ill-equipped response that nevertheless happens. And when all of your cells are doing that, you're getting inflammation everywhere in your body. That's disease. That's it right there in a nutshell.
And I think that image is not how we're taught to think about disease, as something that originates within us due to inefficiencies in our energy production and storage and transport, where we think of disease as, I don't know, like something that invades from the outside, perhaps, but not as something that we can prevent within ourselves through the right things we eat and taking care of the body in the right way so that it produces energy in an efficient way. I don't think anyone is used to thinking of disease that way as the result of inefficient energy production. I think people would be maybe shocked to hear that, but it actually fits with the direction of a lot of people are going in terms of just in secular culture as well. But you've landed it now in a Christian context, tying it to God's design. Like our bodies are designed to intake food and produce energy in this remarkable way. But when it goes wrong through bad intakes and other things like exercise and lack of sunlight, then the inefficiencies themselves are what produces disease. Like, I don't know of anyone else thinking about it that way.
Yeah, and there are more people these days, and so thank God for it. That we live in this age, and obviously I didn't just come up with that all on my own.
Of course,
I'm just a lay person, like most of your listeners, right? And so it's good that we're starting to have this conversation. Right. This energy piece. What can we actually do about it? Right. And when you start to see, I think we're going to get some new dietary guidelines in December of this year of 2025. So that should be helpful where people, they're using this, right? They're using this information, and hopefully we will get something a little bit better than what we have right now. But because people aren't seeing the problem clearly like that, and of course that's just an approximation. We can't talk about all of the precise, and I don't understand all the the nuance of this either. But I think if people had that idea in their head, they would be pretty well equipped to understand if their diet and lifestyle are promoting the things that are going to cause energy to occur cleanly, or if they're going to be, if they're feeding their engine, if you will, like you mentioned, with bad fuel, right? If your body is a Ferrari, far more intricately designed and wonderfully made than a Ferrari, you would never go to the pump and put in the lowest quality gasoline if you had a Ferrari. I mean, no person would do that.
Right.
And then we eat, God knows what.
Mm-hmm. You beat me to it. Actually, that was a metaphor that I was going to use. That if you take a high performance engine and you give it low quality fuel, yeah, it'll drive the car, but it'll produce lots of byproducts and it will drive the car inefficiently. And you do that for long enough and you will see degraded performance in the car. I mean, that's a massively simplified version of it, versus if you give the engine the right fuel that it needs, because we're talking about something that wasn't put together by man, but something put together by God in terms of engines. What does God want for us to eat? Does he have anything to say about it? And what would happen if we were obedient in that way? And that's the part that I think is so significant from a theological perspective, is, again, looking at the difference between what is God's logic for our body versus what is the machine's logic. If we're following God's logic, if we can first find out what that is and follow God's logic for eating based on the design of the body, then it stands to reason that we will avoid a lot of these modern diseases, but also we will have more strength for life, as Karl Barth would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned before that people think how that disease just kind of happens to them. It's funny how we think of disease in terms of like you have this percentage chance of getting heart disease because your dad had heart disease. So you have a 50% chance of getting it at this time in your life. And we think that it's just like a gamble, like, oh, I'm just going to roll the dice and, hopefully it doesn't happen. Or even worse, people think that disease is just programmed into their genes.
Yeah.
The family history is real, but it has far less to do with genes, I think, than it does with lifestyle. You get your lifestyle a lot of times when you grow up in the same home as your family, when your mom was eating whatever she was eating and doing whatever she was doing when you were pregnant and developing. I mean, there's a lot of morality, I think, to this piece of, it's not specifically outlined in the Bible. Are you following God's design for nutrition or are you not? Because like we said, this was never a concern back in the day, but I think there really is a morality piece to it. And what's interesting is a lot of primitive cultures um, understood this. They
Yeah.
thought of nutrients. I mean, we're so undisciplined in our society today. We think that um, that fertility and childbearing is all about, oh, just take a gummy prenatal vitamin for a little while and you're good. Um, you have ancient primitive cultures, not even ancient, like a couple hundred years ago. Weston A. Price, this famous
Hmm.
dentist who wrote one of the great foundational texts on nutrition. He's going around and he's seeing how these cultures develop these practices where they're spreading out children typically 2 to 3 years, just for just the health piece, just to um, enrich the mom, just to make sure that, they're getting all the nutrients in there, restocked. When they get married, some of these cultures would only get married in the early summer, which is when the pasture was the quickest to grow, and so the milk had the best nutrient value at that time. And so they would put the woman on this diet and not allow them to get married until that
Mm.
point. I mean, we have
Wow.
none of these things are
Wow.
like, we have no discipline right now. Um, and there's a lot of wisdom out there that we're missing, that a lot of people who don't even know anything about God intuitively gathered from just cultural wisdom.
Hmm. And that's the cultural wisdom that we've lost, that disconnection from nature that we just kind of exist in today. Nature is, of course, fallen, but we can still understand ourselves as part of creation and symbiotic with it. That's, I think, the cultural mandate, right? To keep the garden, right? Tend the garden. Is that the cultural mandate? We'll come back to it later. I was listening to a podcast about that earlier. But that we are still part of this. Nature is our. Was it in your book where you talked about Chesterton say creation is our sister, not our mother?
Yeah.
I love that. I love that quote. I'd heard it previously. So we are still part of creation, but we don't act like it. We don't live like it. And that's a relatively new thing, but we are born into it. We're born into the scenario where we're so detached from the rhythms of nature, from what nature produces and provides for us. And in some sense, like, that's a blessing. The amount of food that we have available to us as a society, that we particularly in the West, no longer suffer from food insecurity, and who knows if we ever will again. The historical novelty of that, it's a blessing, but the way that we've gone about doing it has produced the diseases that so many of us suffer from today. And that detachment from the creational logic that we're a part of is what leads us into this position of suffering from lacking God's wisdom in terms of the very immediate task of eating.
Yeah, that's so true. So profound. I think what you just said there is just the loss of wisdom of God's design, and how we haven't been interested in reclaiming that.
Mm-hmm.
It's
So
yeah,
oh,
profound.
please go.
No, yeah,
So
go
just
ahead.
with just a little bit of the time that we have remaining, I wonder if we could talk about some of the foods that we can eat, that we should eat, the way that we should approach the subject of food from this position of metabolic health that we've established. So we can say pretty clearly what's wrong. It's easy to point to the things that are wrong, but it can sometimes be more difficult to point at the things that are right. Or I agree with you that you can go to the most liberal supermarket, right? Like, or the food co-op in your case, or go to a place like Whole Foods, and you find beautiful produce and well taken care of meat and all these things that just look amazing. And then I would go to the Whole Foods near where I used to live, and there's like Buddhist tricycle magazine, you know what I mean? All these, and there's like incense and all this stuff for sale in the aisles. And it's like, they've got this so right in a way that just feels really true, but they get it so wrong in this other way. And so let's talk about what is right about this, and why as well.
Yeah, there is a weird aisle at the food co-op that we have as
Yeah.
well. It's I don't go down that aisle. There's a lot of weird stuff there. Um, but when it comes to the food piece, and there are these things that I think half of it is just getting the bad stuff out, the stuff that
Yeah.
doesn't bear the logic of God's design, that bears more the fallen ingenuity of mankind. And so I have a whole chapter on that. But then, when we talk about the stuff that we should build a diet around, um, I think it's pretty simple, right? You have these
Yeah.
nutrients that you want to make sure are on your plate. Um, and I don't like to just get into it, and I take great pains to avoid this food as just nutrients idea. That's why I have the whole New Testament theology of this conversation about Jesus and how he reveals food to us and how food is something. It's not just made of something. But
Hmm.
sometimes you do have to talk about what is food actually made of. And um, I think the big one that nobody can really argue is you need a lot of protein. This
Yeah.
is obviously a very manly thing. Like we should really be seeking protein, quality protein, and the importance of muscle to your metabolic health. We haven't talked about it, but Dr. Gabby, oh shoot, I forgot her last name. But anyway, Gabrielle Lyon, she's really big on this, and she talks about muscle mass and muscle as the organ of longevity. It is the most
Mm.
important metabolic organ that you can have, and your muscle mass is largely going to determine your health outcomes and your longevity. And it's no secret that eating more protein is conducive to maintaining muscle. Um, but not only just the muscle piece, amino acids are necessary to make everything that your body runs on, whether it's hormones or new cells. You need protein for that. And so I think protein, of my 5 pillars of the plate, if you will,
Hmm.
I think protein is the first one, and it's quality protein. It's not just any old protein. It's about getting the right amino acids in the right combinations so that your body will not only absorb it, but also utilize it to make proteins. So in a nutshell, I think our dietary recommendations when it comes to protein are completely deficient. Um, it's something like zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram or something like that. I can't remember the exact number, but it ends up being a very small amount. It's something like 60-ish grams for like a normal adult man, which is just woefully inadequate. You need something
Yeah.
more like 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. That's what Dr. Gabrielle Lyon recommends. Ideal body weight, meaning the body weight where you would be the most healthy.
Hmm.
So for a lot of people, that might be less than some people's current weight. That might actually be more than your current weight. If you're a little thin and you need to maybe pack on 5-10 pounds of muscle, that would be your ideal body weight. So if you're using that as just a general thumb rule, for a lot of people, that's going to end up being, 150 to 200 grams of protein, which is a lot.
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
have to prioritize that when you're trying to construct a diet. So that's why I consider that to be one of the top priorities. Is it's something you really you have to think about it. It can't be this like extra thing that you throw on your plate. It has to be something that you really think about. The next piece I would say is natural fats. So we want to avoid any sort of man-made adulterated fat, such as, people talk about seed oils, these ultra-processed oils, things like that, your margarines and all that stuff. My basic case is that any fat that bears the logic of God's design is a fat that's good for food. And so that would be,
Hmm.
yes, that includes saturated fat. Um, and it probably maybe even primarily includes saturated fat and monounsaturated fats. So, we shouldn't be shy from eating red meat and some other fatty meats. We shouldn't be shy about cooking our food in traditional fats such as butter and tallow, as opposed to canola oil per se. Coconut oil, all of these things are fantastic, right? You should cook your popcorn in coconut oil. When you start to live by that paradigm, it's much more liberating nutritionally, but it's also, it just tastes better. I mean, who doesn't
Hmm.
like real fat. I mean, if you've ever had chips or popcorn cooked in like real fat as opposed to like cottonseed oil,
Yeah.
you can taste the difference, right?
Yeah.
Fiber is another thing. I think a lot of people do well to eat more fiber. It's not an absolute requirement. I know that, there are going to be carnivores out there that say, I don't eat any fiber. Not everyone should eat more fiber. If you have gut problems caused by metabolic dysfunction, other things like that, maybe you don't need more fiber, but a lot of people could do well to eat more fiber. Um, Another thing is fermented foods. I think that this is a piece that we've almost completely forgotten. But if you just go to the store and just grab some fermented pickles, like the Bubbies, like the real fermented pickles, or some real fermented sauerkraut, not just the stuff with vinegar in it, and just eat it. I mean, just eat it before as an appetizer, right? It's really going to help prepare your gut to receive food. It's normally going to come with electrolytes, which are also great. And just the amount of just good, both alive and dead bugs that you're going to get from that is just so fantastic for your health overall. And I go into that quite a bit into the book. The last thing I think is we're looking for nutrient density. And so that you can't overlook some of the most important vitamins and minerals that are oftentimes deficient from our diets, maybe because of soil depletion or just because of processing and just, the fact that we don't live on the land and stuff like that. So some of those things that I would say are absolutely necessary to consider and prioritize are real whole food vitamin C that might be in the form of a supplement, but do not get the fake ascorbic acid stuff. Get the real whole food vitamin C from camu berries and things like that. Magnesium, if you can look for magnesium rich foods, that's fantastic, but that's also one of those things that's been depleted from our diets and our soils. So supplementing is often going to be necessary for many people. Magnesium is something that directly enables energy function. It's used for almost all of our metabolic processes, and it essentially combats stress in all of its forms, whether that's physical or emotional stress. So just given the stressful lives that we have right now, I think magnesium is going to be one of those big ones that people should really think about. And then other things like retinol, these fat-soluble vitamins are just incredibly important. You get those from like fatty meats, fish, really high-quality dairy. You might be thinking like, okay, this is sounding pretty good. He's telling me to eat like red meat, dairy, another thing we didn't talk about, but bread. Bread is a huge theme of this book. I talked, real bread. Now, my wife started making real bread. We mill our own grains. It's just a little appliance we have right there. It takes 2 seconds. You just throw the grains in there and you have flour in 30 seconds. But just the difference it makes with the taste and the amount of it fills you up. You can put butter on it and it's just a complete, I mean, you can just eat nothing but bread and meat with butter and you would be probably well off just because of the amount of nutrients, the fat soluble vitamins, just everything that's in that kernel that they take out when you eat the bread at the store. If I can offer to people to make one shift, buy a grain mill and get some real grain and make some real bread.
Can you recommend a grain mill, by the way? Because when I read that in the book, I immediately went to Amazon and started looking up grain mills, and I noticed there are a lot of options.
Yeah, so I have the Wonder Mill.
Okay.
Yeah, and Sue Becker is like the bread lady. She's like the Christian bread lady. And so if you've, some people can maybe look for podcasts that feature her. She'll give this discussion in more depth. But she also has a store where she sells a lot of mills. And the Wonder Mill is one that seems to stack up in terms of affordability and longevity. And she recommends it is pricey. It's like $250-$300. But if you're going to make that just a lifestyle change, I think it's absolutely indispensable because now we make pancakes out of it. We make muffins out of it. We make bread, and the kids just, our young kids, they'll eat bread. I mean, they might not eat steak. I wish they would, but they'll eat bread and butter. And so if we can at least give them really good bread, that's a win.
Mm-hmm. Man, there's so many. Do you have a few more minutes? I know that, this is in the middle of a work day for you, and I got so many questions. There are a couple of things that I want to add on to this if we can, but I don't want to keep you. So one of the things that I was so happy about in the book, because again, coming from the New Age, there is a belief out there, and I think the paleo diet kind of like launders it for the mainstream, that agriculture is in itself an evil that has led to all of the ill health that people are experiencing today. They're looking for their one culprit that's leading to all this, and they pin it on agriculture. And so they say we need to return to sort of a more hunter-gatherer, nomadic style of diet, as opposed to not a lifestyle, obviously. And that idea was so deeply ingrained. And of course, Christianity challenges that at the most fundamental level, that Jesus offers his body in the form of bread, right? And so I found that contrast, when I realized it in myself, to be quite powerful about the way that Christianity and Christ pushes back on all these kind of worldly, nature worshiping kind of ideas. And you address that in the book, particularly with the quality of bread, how central that is in the Christian story and in the Christian life. And you just spoke to it just now.
Yeah, I mean, bread, you go back to Genesis 3 right after the fall. What does God say?
Yeah.
Cursed is the ground, and now you're going to be eaters of bread. Mm-hmm. Good luck, right? And so, you're going from freely receiving fruit in the garden to now you have to toil with the ground to make your bread. But man becomes an eater of bread. And that's one of these big themes that I kind of borrow from Leon Kass, is he talks about how bread just shapes mankind, and how agriculture is not this evil, this societal evil. But perhaps God does this so that he can actually redeem humanity. You think about what agriculture requires. It requires you to settle on the land, to pray, season after season for a bountiful harvest. It requires that if people are living in proximity to each other, that they don't raid each other's crops. So you start to see civilization develop, and you start to see rules and laws and decency. And all of these things that we take for granted are embedded in our origin story in the form of bread and agriculture. Mm-hmm. And how could this be so bad? And then, of course, bread is revealed to us as just, it's just what we eat. Man doesn't live on bread alone. I mean, that's implying that man essentially does live on bread, but also should live on the word of God. And then God in Jesus reveals himself as our bread. And so you could take that as just a bread as kind of a stand-in for food in general, which I think it generally is. But I think you can also look at that as any Christian view that discounts bread as a health food. It's just fundamentally mistaken. So I think that's one of those things where you can push back against the paleo piece. Paleo would have us regard cheese and any sort of dairy and bread and all of these things as evils. And for many people in society today, they may be evils, and that's just simply because maybe they're damaged by just the poor health that we've had. I wouldn't tell somebody who has celiac disease to just go out and just start eating bread and milk and just go have fun.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that they're bad inherently. And I think that a lot of people that do have these problems, that do have lactose intolerance or insensitivity to dairy otherwise, or celiac or Hashimoto's, or all these other things that are preventing people from eating gluten in milk, if they would just eat the real stuff, they'd probably find that those things resolve themselves. A lot of people find that when they drink raw milk, that actually has the enzymes that are required to digest the milk, go figure, that it's easier to digest. And a lot of people find, at least by the testimony of Sue Becker, who's been doing this for 30 years, that people even that are told to avoid gluten when they eat real, freshly milled bread. They don't have any of those problems. There are people who have
Yeah.
Hashimoto's disease and all these issues that have bread every day. And so, yeah, part of it is just a cultural, it's a backlash against the fact that we've completely distorted these foods from what they normally are, and they're, contributing to health problems. And then people say, oh, well, you know what? Maybe we should just go back to our hunter-gatherer methods and just avoid all that stuff altogether because civilization is so bad. It's like, well, no, there's actually a middle ground, and that's a Christian diet. And a Christian diet will, you can't think of a better diet. Meat, bread, dairy. I mean, what other diet has those things, right? So if we could cap it off with that, that's it.
So and I love how the last two chapters, which we'll have to leave for readers of the book, gets into meat and steak and some of the theological and cultural responses to that. I felt you handled that really well, but that would be worthy of a conversation in itself. So the second question that I want to get to that I have in my mind is the contrast between wisdom and holiness. Like, I want to make sure, this is just something that's in my mind, is that if someone is doing all of these things, if they have this proper diet, living according to, say, God's nutritional design for us, metabolic health, that doesn't necessarily immediately equate to a form of saintliness or holiness. And I think that's probably another reason why some of these dietary issues get so touchy in our society, is that people who do eat in a more, we'll say, holistic way, they do tend to, particularly in the secular world, conduct themselves in a holier than thou way. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, you can do all of these things and still be a sinner. Like, these two don't necessarily they don't necessarily fit together in that way, let's say.
I agree. I think that maybe to be a very holy person with a strong faith, I think that faith needs to be enacted in the real world by living according to God's design. It's a real tangible thing. And so in that direction, I do think that's the case.
Yes.
In the other direction, I think, I think you're spot on in highlighting that piece of, you can kind of do a lot of the stuff. You can live according to God's design in terms of the things that you're eating and how you're treating your body, and not conduct yourself very morally in other aspects. And so, I think that it's a kind of a two-way argument, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, I think it would be hard to say that you're living a saintly, righteous life and, just eating nothing but Twinkies and microwave chimichangas. That doesn't seem to be right to me. But the other way does not guarantee righteousness either. And it can be really easy to be holier than thou, and just, especially me, I wrote this book, and and then people see me as like the health guy, and so you start to get that image. And if somebody sees you eat a Domino's pizza when you're out, I was at a working party a couple weeks ago helping somebody move, and he gets Domino's, and I'm like, okay, sure, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat some Domino's.
That's fine.
It happens. We live in a broken culture. It's not about, we're not saved by our diet. But I think that some people take that to an extreme and say, oh, we're not saved by our diet, and so screw diet, It doesn't matter at all. I think there's a middle ground that we can recognize that we're not saved by what we eat, but we can also recognize that how we approach nutrition has a great deal to say about how we're really appreciating God's abundant provision and how we're relating to God.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And so just for the third question, for those who have been living outside of that design for a long time, and they receive the conventional wisdom, which I think has some truth in it, that the way to lose fat off your body is through embracing the calories in, calories out paradigm. I see that all the time. Is there some value in that, or is there another way to think about the problem of rectifying some of the errors of a more worldly way of eating, let's say, or a more conventional way of eating? Is there a way to reconcile that within the paradigm that you've provided, within this Nourished by Design paradigm? How can we think about that without resorting to, say, mechanistic solutions?
Yeah, I do think there's something, it's not completely untrue that the calories in, calories out stuff. I mean, if you exercise more and you eat a little bit less, that's probably going to help. I think a lot of people find that their dietary signals and their metabolism doesn't really let them do that effectively. And so people will try to diet by just eating less and working out more. And their body's going to start to send the wrong signals, like they're starving and they just don't know what to do with it. And so I think do all of the above, make sure that you cut out those toxins in the diet that are going to start to send the wrong information in your body. Replace it with the nourishing, life-giving foods that bear the logic of God's design. Work out a little bit more, get some more sleep. Those are all lifestyle factors that certainly can help, but there's no silver bullet. I wouldn't recommend it. Anyone just go out and just go crazy and do the crazy diets and things like that. I think that if you just start to take the baby steps and just cut out some of the bad stuff and just replace it with some of the good stuff and just incrementally improve, incrementally. Hey, this month we're going to get a meal and we're going to learn 3 bread recipes. And then, next month I'm going to put on my shoes for the first time, my walking shoes, and we're going to go out and we're going to lift some weights, even if it's just for 10 minutes. You just start to stack those habits. And then eventually you get to the point where it's just so ingrained and your body's just so used to those things and it's sending the right signals. That's when I think that's where the productive lifestyle change really happens.
Are you going to write a fitness book next?
Fitness would be interesting. I don't know if it's as profound as food, because Jesus doesn't say that I'm like the barbell of life. He says that I'm the bread of life. And so there's so much profoundness to that theologically. But I do think that fitness is a thing that is important. And I think that, David Mathis wrote a little theology of fitness, I think is what he calls it. So that might be a good resource for people, from Desiring God. I think there are actually a few more kind of Christian fitness people out there that have tackled this. So I'm probably going to check out Mathis's book on that and see what happens.
Wonderful. It's a great recommendation. Well, the book is Nourished by Design. Again, as you can probably tell, I got so much out of reading this book. I not only learned a lot, I enjoyed reading it. And it's definitely going to have an impact in my household and my health as well. So I really can't thank you enough for this book. And where would you like to send people to find out more about you and what you do?
Amazon is going to be the best place to get the book. I do have a page on there in the back where I direct people to a little website. nourishedbydesignbook.com is a way you can get in contact with me if you're interested. But yeah, just engaging with the work. I love to hear people's comments, and I hope it's really helpful for people.
Wonderful. Well, it was for me. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thanks, Will.